Welcome to the Captain's Table. I am Captain Shan, and this is the story of Hershin and Teru. This was episode 10 of season 1 of my 2018, 2019, 2020 campaign called Star Trek Explorations, and the episode of this title was The Center Cannot Hold. This was a strange episode. I think I probably only made it up within a few days of writing it, of running it, and it was heavily dependent on the background story of one particular player character run by my friend Alice. She had a character named Teru, the ship's chief medical officer, and this Vulcan character had a pretty hefty backstory. I don't always use every detail of a character's backstory, but I think it's good for the players to know their own character backstory. It's useful for them. And sometimes the GM can find something useful out of it. So, the episode background here is that the previous episode, they had arrived on a planet called Thorn, where the local Tellarite population had this strange cult. Not a harmful cult, actually a very peaceful cult, but there were also some aliens living under a mountain nearby, and they had to interact with these and find out why they were hiding there and what they were doing, and the plot of that was basically stolen directly from one of the story elements of the video game Star Trek 25th Anniversary. That episode 9, went fine. It was interesting. It was a good opportunity for the player character Captain, who was also a Tellarite, but a more traditional Tellarite, Captain Nov Thogev, played by Brad, to explore what it means to be a Tellarite and how many of them are argumentative, but here's this whole cult who are the exact opposite of that, and are they still proper Tellarites that way? And it's interesting cultural exploration. But there was also this weird gas that had come up in a episode much earlier on, I think episode 3 or so, episode 2 even, that was some sort of mind-altering psychoactive drug of some sort, and it had disturbed the players the first time they interacted with it. Then the Xenians, the aliens living under this mountain, turns out they were the ones responsible for this gas. It was not harmful to them, so they didn't think anything of it. But Tellarites and humans and Vulcans and so on, it was quite a serious, do I mean psychoactive or something else? Well, a mind-bending kind of a drug. And even had certain telepathic properties to it. So they had been exposed to this stuff in the previous episode. They hadn't really thought of it too much. They thought they were fine. Which gave me a great setup for episode 10. And in particular, tying it together with Commander Teru's character background. Because Commander Teru was not always known as Teru. She had actually begun her life as a Vulcan named Hershin, and Hershin had been a captain in the Vulcan High Command, and a particular incident in her path had changed her behavior, and it had been covered up, and none of the player characters knew about it at this point, except for Alice, obviously, who'd written it for her own character. But there was a brief conflict set before the time of Enterprise between the Vulcans and the Tellarites. And Hershin enforcing a Vulcan blockade on certain Tellarite colonists who had ended up, the surviving ones anyway, had ended up arriving on this planet Thorn. Hershin had enforced the blockade. It ended up killing a whole bunch of Tellarites, innocent civilian colonists, and that gave her pause to reconsider her life and her morals and so on, and change her identity completely into Taru, which nobody else knew about. So how do I, as GM, fit that into the story? How do I make a personal, private secret that basically the Vulcan High Command doesn't exist anymore? They've the bureaucracy has forgotten about this. Starfleet, I don't think, was ever aware of this in the first place. They only ever knew the alternate Taru identity. They didn't know the Hershin background, and certainly none of the player characters knew about this. But then everybody gets exposed to this weird gas. And what happens is they all fall into Taru's mind. And Taru's mind is a weird place, it turns out. First thing they experience is a memory from the Tellarite point of view. So this is obviously an imagined memory, not Hershin's personal experience, of life as these Tellarite colonists on their colony ship, traveling through space, meeting this Vulcan blockade. And immediately things are very strange for the players, because the other Tellarites that they're seeing don't look real. They look blocky. They look like they're made out of wood. And it's sort of a dreamscape situation, so it's hard to focus on this specifically in enough detail to be sure of what they're seeing, but that's the impression that I told them their characters got. And then the ship gets hit by weapons fire from the Vulcans, and things start going wrong, and people get pulled out into the vacuum, and horrible things like that. And they're all brought into the... they get into escape pods. The shuttles and escape pods and things are then pulled into the Vulcan shuttle bay. And that's where they emerge, and they start seeing Vulcans surrounding them, armed, dangerous, aggressive, and looking like they're not real people. They are also blocky wood creatures, not realistic, dream creatures. And again, in an imagined dream kind of way, these blocky soldiers start advancing on the surviving Tellarites and the player characters, who find that they are also all appearing to be Tellarites. Quite a lot more happens from here, but basically they get an opportunity to see these rescued colonists getting massacred in the shuttle bay by Vulcan soldiers. Whether that actually happened or not, kind of irrelevant. This is Taru / Hershin's way of remembering the situation. Then they go through a series of other rooms, and each of these rooms I sort of customized to fit one of the particular player characters and their personality and their values, which are a specific game mechanic in Star Trek Adventures. And the color of each room changed in accordance with that. The type of puzzle that they found in each room varied in accordance with that. The NPCs that they bumped into varied in a similar sort of way. And I'll probably attach a link to my very, very brief notes on this, because I didn't give a lot of detail on this. Because the other thing that varied with each room was a little scrap of piece of paper that I handed to Alice every time they changed location, telling her the specific mood that was relevant in each room. And I left it up to her to play out what her character would say and do in that room. And therefore, based on that, I interpreted how the NPC blocky Vulcan creatures would act in that room as well. So, in a way, we were kind of co-GMs of this, Alice and I. She got to decide the personality of each room based on this, one-word cue that I gave her. And based on that, I made the events unfold and responded to the players in an appropriate way. Very weird episode. Eventually, this leads them to the computer core of this Vulcan ship, which represents, if I remember right, Alice's pure logical Vulcan side, her pure memory of things in a more realistic way, and her ability to work things out according to rational argument. And this is now finally, I mean, everything before this was just a roller coaster. The players were getting pushed from room to room in a confusing, disorienting way, kind of a roller coaster, railroad, right? Um, Sometimes a railroad is useful, right? If it's a limited little railroad, not the entire adventure. But then they finally get to this computer core, and this is where they finally have the opportunity to speak to Taru directly, right? To the real Taru, not the imagined Hershin character, and find out what all of this means, what it all represents, what her actual history was, and what they need to do to resolve all of this. And the captain, the Captain Thogev, he was very understanding of all of this. He made it very clear that he had no interest in his chief medical officer and incidentally also first officer's personal history. If it was legally resolved by the Vulcans, then he was happy to consider it done. He was aware that she had become a new person, and he was only interested in the new person, not the old person. The rest of the player characters more or less agreed with that and made it clear that they were going to be welcoming of Taru and wouldn't hold her Shin's past against her. And they figured out a way to make it all work, make it all better again. And with that, the dream sequence fades out, and they're all still standing there on Thuln. The locals are looking at them, and they're all very confused. But then they get to go back to their own ship and return to Starbase. And whether the captain meant it at that point about whether he would keep Hershin's his history secret from Starfleet, now is the point where that starts to play out. And it did keep coming up in a lot of the next two seasons, 2 years worth of gameplay. Taru versus Hershin kept being an interesting character element of the Taru character. And Alice was usually quite clear that, oh, well, now's a time that Hershin is actually going to pop back into relevance and make the character do something a little bit nastier for a change. And everybody knew what she was talking about because they had experienced her own memories firsthand. So, what's this got to do with everything else that I've been explaining? Well, first of all, theme and tone. I think it's pretty clear that this is all about acceptance of people's differing backgrounds. Taru personally came to accept that Tellarites have just as much right to life as Vulcans do, right? And was therefore instrumental in doing her little part later on to help the United Federation of Planets form. We never really went into that into huge detail, but it was kind of implied that she'd had a little role to play in that. And even went on to join the new Federation Starfleet and, you know, work together with a Tellarite captain and humans and Dorians and all sorts of others, Denobulans. It also allowed the rest of the player characters to dig into the same theme, the same notion that they should be accepting of people's backgrounds, because here they've got basically someone who's committed almost an act of genocide, certainly mass murder. How are they going to still work with this person? Are they still going to work with this person? The theme of justice also comes into this. Has Hershin been punished enough that Taru gets to get away with it scot-free? One of the possibilities I had considered when coming up with this adventure was that they might actually write the character out of the campaign, that Taru would be sent off to jail and prosecuted for, you know, killing dozens, maybe hundreds, I can't remember the exact number right now, but lots of Tellarites, innocent civilian Tellarites. They certainly could have justified that. They chose not to. They chose to go with tolerance and acceptance taking it as given that she has demonstrated a change of personality, a change of heart. So, certainly tone and themes were relevant here. Improv, I think I've made clear, was definitely relevant to this. I did not know how each room would be presented exactly. That was left in Alice's hands. She was deciding a whole lot of the game for me. The players' responses to what Alice presented to them and what I presented in more firm GM kind of ways, also very much improvised. Couldn't have guessed what they would do, couldn't have guessed how they would handle each room that they had to pass through. Certainly couldn't have anticipated for certain how they would deal with things in the end. Everything was very much made up as we went along. I think what helped a lot with that was being very vivid with my descriptions, making it clear how different each room was from the previous one, putting a lot of emphasis on the change of color, the change of the NPC's personalities. Whatever Alice had decided was going to be her input for each episode, so each room, trying to flesh that out as much as possible for the players, so that it was a very tangible difference for them, so that they could find out what they were supposed to be taking away from the experience. But I didn't know what that was going to be until we got to each room. I certainly didn't know in detail. Yeah. The whole thing, of course, is a puzzle. This was definitely a people puzzle. The person in question being Taru, but the players didn't initially know that. So to them it felt more like a physical puzzle, a kind of a weird maze where they just went from room to room, very linear fashion. But clearly there was something that they had to do differently in each room, something that they had to figure out in each room. And then finally they get to the final puzzle, talking with Taru / Hoshin and figuring out how to deal with this person's background. That's a puzzle, right? Again, this is a puzzle without a set ending. I did not know how it would end. But clearly they had to do something, they had to discuss something with Alice and her character to figure it out. And it worked out really well. It was an interesting challenge for them. They had to understand, first of all, that they were not in reality, that this was some imagined scenario or an illusion of some sort. Then they had to get an idea of what it was representing to them, and then of course they had to solve it, right? So several different stages to their ability to figure out the puzzle, and they managed to get through it, right? It was varying difficulty as they went through. I think some of the rooms were much easier, more obvious than others, but yeah, they got through it eventually, and it was a good challenge to them. And in terms of characters, I think this was obviously good for Taru's character, gave her a lot of depth and expressed a lot of her character to the other players that they didn't know about before. She was much more rounded after this. But also the other players got to express their own characters. What do they do when they're frustrated? What do they do when they're confused and mystified by weird, illusionary Vulcan starships from the past? How do they respond to clearly imagined woody people instead of real people? Do they treat them better or worse? Do they assume that they're not real, therefore not important? All different things for their characters to express, and they did all handle this differently. And it was a good way of getting to know all of the characters well by focusing on one particular character. And then in terms of pacing, it was definitely slow to begin with. Early on in the shuttle bay, where they watched the civilians get massacred, that dragged on a lot longer than I'd intended, because they just kept seeing this wave of woody Vulcan soldiers coming towards them, and they kept thinking, oh, well, there's something we can do about this. We can fight them. This is A battle scene. Nope, nope. You shoot them, another one pops up in its place. Okay, well, there's got to be something we can do to get out of here. We steal shuttle. Nope, the shuttles are just wooden props. They don't do anything. How you got in here, you have no idea, but that's what the situation currently is. There's a door over there that seems to be the only exit. Okay, well, the Vulcan Woody people are advancing on the door. We might not get there in time. Well, yeah, they are advancing on it, but you know, if you really run, you can probably just about squeeze past them. Okay, but we're worried. What if we don't make it in time? And so it dragged on. Right? The pacing of that initial room was difficult because there was really just one exit for them to take. Space outside was just an illusion. Everything inside the room, basically also an illusion. The door, also an illusion in a way, but the step to the next part of the illusion. And once they'd gotten through this first room, out of the shuttle bay into the next room, well, then they got the idea. We're in a room, there's something to do in this room, and then there's one door that leads us out. And once we're done with things, we take the next door. So pacing did improve, but initially it was a little bit uncomfortable. And I think I stuck to my guns with that. I kept, trying to nudge them gently towards the only possible door, without making obvious to them that you must go through that door. That is your only obvious solution. I think that would have been wrong of me to push them that obviously. But I also couldn't let the advancing Vulcans just squish them completely, because then what? Then we've only been playing for 10-15 minutes and we've got to end the whole scenario. That would have been a little bit lame. So GM patience is also important for pacing. Sometimes it does take 20 minutes to get through a door, just because the players don't understand that the door is there, and how important the door is. So patience is important. Then once we were out into the rest of it, then the pace picks up. They start figuring out, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this, depending on what room they went into and how it was presented to them. That all flowed better. The only time we then really slowed down again after that was the final central computer core, where we took the time to thoroughly discuss things in a lot of detail. Because this was where Alice finally got to be her full self, both Teru and Hershin, both speaking in their full personality for the first time. And I think obviously she had to improvise this all as well, because I didn't really tell her before the session that this is what was expected of her. I just threw it at her and let her speak her mind. And it was a really good opportunity, but the pacing of it was important. We had to keep the players thinking that, there's a way out of this, there's something we've got to say or do to be let out of this dream. But also give them time to think it through. Let them get to know the situation properly. Let them figure out what's bothering Teru. Why is she hidden this half of her character all along? And then discuss amongst themselves, how are we going to get out of it? Okay? So we intentionally slowed down there, and it worked out pretty well. And then they get back into the real world, back to their ship. They, again, wanted to take a fairly long time to discuss the implications of all this. How did this change each of their characters' feelings about Teru? What did they each want to do with Teru? Were they going to stick with the captain's promise that they weren't going to turn her into the authorities or expose her in any way? They needed some time to explore that as well. And it was pretty clear at this point that the adventure was over. They'd escaped, they'd gotten back to the ship. But it was still important to give them time to process things, to calm down, to flatten out their experiences, and each have their say about how they felt about this change. And they took that opportunity and it worked. Okay? Was this planned? Barely. There was really just a very thin outline I'd given myself, a skeleton of these are the steps that will be available to them. What they did in each of those rooms depended very much on the players. How they went from room to room, what they considered important in each room, how much time they spent there, what they did when they got out in the end, that was all on the players, right? They filled up the flesh. I set up the skeleton, I put them in it, and they filled in the rest for me, and it worked really well. right? Very deep character session, possibly the deepest character session I've ever run, because the character was just free to express herself however she wanted, and the others were free to, and in fact encouraged to, probe her personality as much as they wanted, to find out whatever they wanted to about her, because their survival now kind of depended on it. They had to get to know this character much better than before in order to figure out what to do next, how to solve the puzzle. So, hopefully, that's a useful example to you of how you can take all the other advice I've given so far and package it together into one hopefully enjoyable and fun story that works for you, right? And you don't have to do exactly what I did. We never did anything like that again. That was a once-off type of adventure for us. We did very different things in other episodes. But basically not going anywhere, everybody just standing in place and dreaming, we got to explore quite a lot. And it doesn't always have to be exploring the stars and going off to discover things outside. Sometimes it's also good to do some internal exploration as well. And that's what the Center Cannot Hold gave us.